Welcome to the GovComms podcast, bringing you the latest insights and innovations from experts and thought leaders around the globe in government communication. Now, here is your host, David Pembroke.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to GovComms, the podcast that examines the practice of content communication in government and the public sector. My name's David Pembroke, and thank you for joining me today. We have a wonderful guest for you today. Andrew Parkinson has 20 years' experience covering a broad range of communication and public affairs practice. He's done all sorts of proactive and responsive media handling. He's done strategy, operations, and in fact, he has led teams in the communication field inside government. Most recently, Andrew was the Director of Media and Social Media with a major New South Wales government department here in Australia. And his responsibility was really to build and to lead teams of media and content specialists who were there to support the department and its ministers on issues such as planning, energy, water, mining, resources, skills, international trade, small business. It went on and on and on. It was a huge remit, but plenty of great stories in there to tell. Prior to being in government, Andrew held senior positions in financial services and not-for-profit organisations. He began his career as an industry advocate and lobbyist in London. He was the head of communications for the British Chambers of Commerce, as well as campaigns and government relations manager for Make UK, the peak body for engineering, manufacturing and technology companies. Alongside his undergraduate qualifications, he also has a Master's in Public Administration, and he joins me on the line right now. Andrew, welcome to GovComms.
Thank you so much, David. That was a very generous and kind introduction you gave me.
No problem at all, but a great career and a great interest. What is it that you like or indeed love about working in government communications?
Oh, look, I think that introduction kind of tells the story. I think, the scope and depth of work that you can engage in this field is just vast. And, on any given day or in any given year, you can be working, across so many different issues. And that's really important to me because I think keeping the sort of interest alive and finding new ways to tell stories across, often complex policy areas, it's a real passion for me.
But it's also the purpose that sits beneath it all, doesn't it? Because if you can do a good job, you can have that impact where you can improve the way things are in communities.
Exactly right. And I think, the important thing about any communication role in government is always to remember that, the job is to build that connection between, those that are making decisions at that level and the communities that they're serving.
It's a fascinating time, isn't it, for government communicators, and given the fact that you have been around for 20 plus years, as we see governments increasingly having to grapple with the changed capability that is now at their call should they choose to use it. And when you have massive events such as the coronavirus that where the government is dealing with at the moment, earlier this year we had the devastating bushfires in Australia. It's the need and requirement of the citizen to get information really seems to be outstripping government's capability to deliver. How is government going to be able to move to the point where it can meet those expectations of citizens and stakeholders?
Wow, that's a really big question to answer simply. But look,
well, let's break it down then. I think that might be a good way to go about it. Like, that is a big question and it's a big challenge, and I've got my own views. But where do they start?
Well, look, I think disaster, crisis, whatever you want to call these events, they're not the concept of these things and is not new. And certainly, 20 plus years ago, I remember dealing with, similar instances. I think it was back in the day, it was a fuel crisis in the UK that working at the British Chambers of Commerce, I was kind of at the centre of in terms of the business response. And you apply I think in a communication role, you apply the same principles. I applied the same principles back then as would be applicable now. The difference is, I think, a couple of things. I think that you're right. The sort of appetite and expectation around information delivery is, much more amplified. And secondly, of course, we're living in as we weren't then, but we are now living in a 24/7 news cycle. And so, yes, that becomes much more challenging when it comes to kind of getting the right message out at the right time to the right group.
Indeed, and I think that's that's part of it. But if we pick apart some of the sort of established practice that government has used for many years to communicate, and I heard a story the other day about here in Australia during the recent bushfire crisis, circulations of things like 30 pages of talking points that were going across all government agencies, expected to be used by ministers and others to tell the story of the government. And in this most recent crisis around, the health crisis with the coronavirus, that every time content was at the point of approval, having gone through the approvals processes, the story had moved on. And so the work that was done in creating FAQs and the traditional mechanisms of government, again, way too slow, way too cumbersome, way too big and comprehensive, not targeted, therefore not useful, and and missing that cycle, missing that point. So how does government move from sort of these analog expressions of communication to a far more agile digital approach that meets the needs of citizens?
Yeah, look, really, really good points there, and I can't say I'm hugely surprised at the anecdotal evidence that you've cited there, but I think certainly in my experience in the places I've worked, there is a real appetite to embrace technology to solve some of those problems. That approvals process. Is I think always an issue because people need to make sure that decisions are made at certain levels, and it's important for those decisions to be reflected, and the currency of those decisions to be reflected in what's being said publicly. But I think there's with the challenge of technology comes the opportunity, and I think there's lots of great tools that can be used to capture and disseminate messaging in a much more efficient and much more accessible way. One example let me give is around video and the use of social media, and where one of the things I was keen to sort of drive in my last role was to really get people thinking differently about how we deliver media announcements. Traditionally, as we've always sort of gone through that process of drafting a media release and having it approved and making the necessary changes and
syncing without trace.
Yeah, and it could be it could take a while for that to run through the process. But I think if you've got I think the other part of this, David, let me just digress a bit, is I think increasing appetite by ministers who've got a really keen eye on presentation, obviously, really keen eye on that, and increasing appetite from them for something different to better connect with the audience. So in the case of a media release, yes, let's go through that process, but it's just as easy to draft a video script for review by a minister, to put it in their own words, put them in front of a camera, and get a 30-second grab from them, and then package that up with a few visuals and push that out on social media, and you'll find the reach is much better. It's much more accessible. People tend to kind of understand the message better because it's seen, it's not read, seen and heard, it's not just read. And even sort of taking that further, we were back then we were breaking news through video presentation like that. and then following up with the media release for the nuts and bolts of the detail. So I think how does one apply that sort of technology in a situation like COVID-19? Well, look, I think we're having to learn really fast about how best to do that. And I think one of the sort of opportunities, if you like, from a situation like this is you do have to kind of learn those lessons pretty quick. And the whole world's feeling this and having to deal with this. And I guess for governments, it's imperative for them to be looking around the world and to see who's doing it best and just emulate that.
Yeah, well, there's a lot in that you've in that answer. I want to unpick a bit, go through a bit of it. But regular listeners to this show will note my emphasis on approvals, because it's my, it's got to get solved. If content is going to move faster, there has to be a way for content to be able to meet the certain risk thresholds.
Yeah.
And then needs to be a buy-in to enable story to move at the appropriate speed. Now, if you're, coming out to make a national announcement to, the Australian population about COVID-19, that needs absolute rigor. But if you are, if it's not at that level, and it's something, we just need a different scale in which to deal with things so that things can move a bit faster. Because my great fear is that if we continue to slow the process, government will continue to struggle for relevance, and the issue around trust, which is a very real issue, becomes compounded when people say, well, they're not telling us. Now, it's not for lack of wanting to tell you, but the processes at the moment don't allow.
Slow it up.
They just slow it up too much, and it gets to the point of no, that's old news. That's gone. That's next. We really have to take a whole of system approach to this to try and think of ways where we can get that information moving, because the public service owes it to the elected government of the day to be able to explain what those policies and programs are. That's the job.
Yeah.
That's the job.
Yeah. I agree. Look, just listening to what you're saying about approvals, and it doesn't really address it directly, but it's interesting to sort of see and compare the response, certainly in New South Wales, to the bushfire events of earlier in the year, to compare that to what's going on now, perhaps at federal level with COVID-19. And, I don't think there was anyone in New South Wales that didn't know who Shane Fitzsimmons was, and now doesn't know who Shane Fitzsimmons was, because, I think having him be the conduit for pretty much all of the relevant messaging about the situation, how it was unfolding, and what preparations were being made, and how the issues were being addressed. I think that really impacted. And you talk about trust. I think you saw all of the sort of the editorial and the commentary around his performance and his contribution to the communication effort around the bushfires. I don't think we're seeing the same thing with COVID-19. I think that's a very different story. So I think that's one point. Doesn't really address your approvals point, but I hear what you're saying about this, and I think you mentioned it just there. It's all about mapping the risk, and so certainly in my experience, it's been really important for me to early on, with the clients that I'm servicing, whether it's ministers or department officials, to really clarify that risk profile and effectively delegation in terms of messaging going out. And so, if it's low visibility, low risk, then they really don't need to be too worried about that. But if we're getting into the sort of high risk, high visibility quadrant, then clearly some principles need to be set out as to how those approvals and that messaging and the communication process will operate with issues at that level.
There's no doubt in my mind that that is part of the secret to unlocking some of this problem, is for communications professionals to embrace this concept of risk and to be able to speak in the language of risk, because that's how senior executives think. That's what's on their mind. They are thinking it. Senior members of government departments are thinking about the risks for their ministers, and therefore, if you want to be relevant in that space, you have to be able to communicate around risk. You have to communicate around benefits. You have to communicate about value and impact and return on investment. So that's one of the big keys, I think, is that communication has to mature its approach such that it speaks in the language of the C-suite or the senior executive, and therefore gets on their level and helps them to understand these benefits that are considerable. Because again, go to your point there around the performance of Shane Fitzsimmons. It was masterful, really, the way that he owned the story. The good, the bad, the indifferent, and it didn't matter who you were. He was comprehensive. He was clear. He was thoughtful. He was authentic. He was, his performance was, top shelf. It was, as you say. And I know, during the bush, sitting here in Canberra, we watched him. We were tuned live. The television was on, and every time he got to speak, we were sitting in front of the television listening to what he had to say.
And I think that speaks to the trust point, because you're right. As soon as you see Shane Fitzsimmons on screen, he's going to say something of value and importance.
Yeah.
And I think that's another important consideration. What you say about risk is absolutely spot on. And when people ask me what I do, often it's hard to explain, in detail. So I always just say, it really is about the job. Really is about minimising risk and maximising opportunity for government work. And so, I am absolutely behind you on that point about speaking in the language of risk. I think the other, just an additional point around that, though. I mean, for those. So taking that further, if you're in that quadrant of high visibility and high risk, there are a lot of these situations have very similar impacts and on perception, and therefore require often quite similar mitigation. And so I think there's work that you can do in preparation, and you should be doing in preparation to help you through let's say a crisis like this. It's well documented. I think you only have to Google, to find an adequate crisis comms plan. And if you've got the capability and the resource to shape that around your particular issue, I think that's a really useful thing to be doing. When you've got that time to think more deeply about what you would do in a situation like this. The worst thing you can do is wait for it.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
So just to your point, I think you made in response to one of the earlier questions, this nature of evolving capability within government communications teams, because as we do move into the digital realm, yes, there is always going to be a place for offline communication, particularly in around the engagement functions of politicians and senior government officials, where you do need to be face-to-face and speaking, and lots of events and other things that are critically important. But clearly, as we move into the digital realm and everybody is carrying a supercomputer in their pocket where they can receive and send information, How have you started to address that in terms of the way that you've structured your team? I heard you say a little bit earlier around video, and I'm super interested in this because as we move to, the 5G networks, lower latency networks, more sensors, greater computing power, the impacts of artificial intelligence and machine learning, it would seem to me that video is going to become the key to much of government communication. So could you just explain perhaps your journey down this path to video, and perhaps to look forward and see where you think video is going to go in terms of the armoury of the government communicator?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think going to become it kind of implies that it's yet to happen. I think it's already there, mate. And I think if people are coming to this too late, they're going to sort of miss the boat. And I think that's important, for all sorts of reasons, in terms of everything from building the right capabilities in teams to support ministers and officials, but also in terms of attracting the right people into government work. So, my journey, I suppose in recent years, last five or so years, realised that there was, what I think they call, there's a name for this now. It's retail politics, but I think it's, from a lot of politicians, they want to be seen to be engaging in a more authentic way with their constituents, and also be seen to be effectively channels for government policy and government messaging, channels in themselves. And so with the advent of social media, and with the advent of better, more accessible use of video on social media, I think a lot of politicians and a lot of government officials are looking at that, the opportunity to sort of use that technology to deliver through that channel. And so early on, so it's a few years ago, one of the approaches that I took was to equip my team with really basic video technology, nothing really more than an iPhone, and some kit, microphones and what have you, that they could use to go out with ministers when they were doing the things that ministers do, presenting at events, making announcements. And generally those announcement events would be serviced, with a media pack that would go to the minister's office a few days before. And, the minister would make the announcement, the release would go out. In this instance, my team were able to capture footage of the minister making the announcement, of the minister being in situ, of commentary from the audience to which the minister was speaking, and then edit that footage back at the shop into a short video, effectively 45-second, a minute and a half video, and then post that as a complementary part of the announcement package. And so that's kind of where it began, and it really took on its own momentum. Ministers really loved it, and so we'd get, I think I was servicing 6 ministers, I think, at the time with my team. And I remember, their advisors telling me that other ministers were asking them how they managed to get this content, which is, a great sign of its success. And then, more recently in my last role, I had a few departures, just regular attrition in the team. And I wanted to do 2 things. One, more fully integrate the social media team that I was running with let's call it the traditional government media team. But I also wanted to bring in that visual component to that integrated team. And so in terms of placement, when I had those vacancies, instead of going out there and recruiting, ex-government or ex-journos or ex-government ex-print journos or ex-government people, I specifically looked for people with TV experience, so TV producers, and I was lucky enough to find 2. And so my kind of read of that was they were bringing that capability into the team, and really and truly I could get them up to speed on the issues and on the government process pretty quickly. And then I also a few months after that, recruited a cameraman, professional cameraman. And so, we really kind of, in terms of quality of outcome, quality of product, we really upped the game on some of that work. And it was, a really interesting to build that out. So, it's not just ministerial support, but, let's take internal comms, and let's take internal comms and the sort of the impact that being involved in a visual presentation of work can have. So let me give you an example. When the North West Rail Link was announced here in New South Wales, big infrastructure project, been planned and been in process for many years, and obviously owned by Transport. And so Transport, made a lot of noise about realising that project. But of course, I was at the Department of Planning. There were a bunch of people in a team that had been working on that project many years earlier, in terms of preparing the plans and identifying the right developments around the site and all of that kind of stuff. But up until the point that it happened, of course, their engagement in that project had only been really theoretical because they'd been planning it. And so one thing we were able to do was to in order to sort of get involved in that celebration of the project activation, really simple. We just took the team, to take a train ride on the train that they'd envisioned, and we took the camera crew, and we captured their excitement and anticipation of getting on the train.
I like that.
Yeah, and it really, the story told itself through the delight you could see on their faces at seeing their vision realised. And so, that was a really good execution of use of video. And of course, we used, that content comes across very authentically and very naturally. And so, of course, we used that internally to sort of generate a bit of excitement within the internal teams about the work that they do and how important and valuable is the contribution that they make. But we're also able to use it as an educational tool to let people, our audiences, our external audiences, better understand what planning is, what planning people do.
No, it's a good point that you raise around the power, and often I think we forget about the importance of internal communication. And again, if we do, we miss that impact that we can have as communicators to build great teams and inspire great teams. And it never hurts to sell the work that you do internally, so as that people can see the value that communication is having. And often, again, it's the demands of ministers and external is often the case, but it's really taking that wider view. And that's a very simple execution that you just raised. It wouldn't have taken much more effort to really, because I'm sure you did all of the other stuff as well, but this was just a nice little next layer of the story. It's another part of that story.
I think you're right, and I think if you're building, if you're building the culture and using comms to build the culture, you're going to get a better group of people doing more of what they love. And if people are doing more of what they love and enjoying their work, you're going to get more authentic and more compelling and more engaging story out of that as well. So, really, really important. And, consider, David, I don't know what the federal number is, but, in New South Wales, there's something like 300,000 people in the public service. Yeah. And so, that's a lot of story to tell.
Yeah. And most of them are having a dig every day and doing great things, to make the community stronger. Actually, just if I might take you back, you mentioned that in the first instance with your, let's call them your native team, the team that you had at the beginning, how did you upskill them so as that they could take their phones and get at least acceptable quality? And obviously with the microphones, the sound would have been a bit better, but how difficult was it to turn those people into content creators?
Not difficult at all. I think, most of the team, if not all of them, were what I'd call traditional government media people, and I think they were hankering for some opportunity to develop new skills, be more creative, really build out the depth of their experience in the job, rather than just do the same thing every day. And so I think I was more than halfway there, given there was a strong will for people to do something differently. And then in terms of meeting the other half of that requirement, I'd recruited again. I'd integrated social and media. And I'd recruited a couple of great people who were very proficient around, the capture and editing of visual content, for the purpose of delivering through a social media channel. So, they were exceptional talents that I was able to leverage to support the education and training of the traditional team.
Yeah, okay. So now, when you look at the perfect government comms team, the modern comms team, what does it look like? Does it have a data scientist in it in this day and age to be able to interrogate the data for the insights that helps to drive the content? How much of it should be in this creation? How much in the distribution? How much in the strategy? How, if you had an unlimited budget, how would you structure a bit of a team, and what would it look like?
Good question. Look, I think there's a number of elements to make a good and effective and team in the modern context.
Yep.
And I think. Let me just think it through. So, I think sort of capabilities, proactive capabilities. So, people who can kind of spot a story and, get deep in the business and understand, what's news and what isn't, both in terms of risk and opportunity. I think on that proactive side as well, people who really understand audience and have that ability to really think through how to target an audience in the right way. Obviously, in the context of COVID, there's very different messaging going out, I imagine, to ethnic audiences than there are to the general Australian population, and as there should be. So, so people who kind of understand that the importance of that kind of proactive work and audience focus, I think. Reactive capabilities, so and responsive capabilities. So people who are, fantastic writers, but can also navigate complex issues very quickly and understand, get a quick understanding of what it takes to effectively, address an issue, whether it's something negative that you've got to deal with and negotiate through, or whether it's something that you can actually turn into something that's going to benefit your organisation or client. I think digital is another important capability. I just don't think there's no way of surviving the modern media challenge for a government operator if you don't have some appreciation of the need for digital skills. And I guess what I mean by that is just having the sort of the mindset of digital first, and thinking in that space about ways you can really innovate and change your approach to get the step ahead that you need. So let me give you an example there. One of the things through the integration of traditional and social media that I did in the last job was to effectively draft the media release, put the video together, what have you, but break the news on social media. So effectively draft up a post that linked to the URL of the media release, and tagged the relevant journalists, influencers, key audiences in the post. And that would go first, and that meant that we were, first with the news. When the analytics through Google were the analytics through Google are equally as important, through search. And so, being the originator of the content, it meant that we were top of the search when it came to looking for the story. And it also meant that that by posting through social first and making it easy for those influencers and journalists to access the information and share it, it meant much bigger engagement for us. So it's those sorts of that sort of understanding and those sorts of tools are really important, I think. I think the measurement and valuation side of things is also critical because, and even more so these days, because it's so important not to waste time and waste effort in misdirecting your communications. And so I think the leaner and more effective you can be in knowing that what you're pushing out is reaching the target, that's really important. I don't know if that warrants hiring data scientists, but look, I think I'm really interested in that area of work, and so kind of that's my ideal unlimited budget and what's sort of ahead in the future. I think we're looking at and I'm sure you've done podcasts on this before, David. Artificial intelligence and the impact that that's having on communications. I find that a really interesting space. I think behavioural insights and the opportunities there to kind of really get a much better understanding of what your audience is going to accept, what they want, what they don't want, and how they're gonna consume your content. I think really interesting kind of areas of examination, and I think when I'm next in a position to build a team, I'll be looking at some of those areas.
Yeah, I have this saying that it's a team sport, and you really do need the team. And I think in this day and age, the way technology is changing, communication, these sort of traditional silos are being broken apart, and you really do need to think sort of horizontally as to who can you bring in into your team. So instead of going to war with the behavioural scientists, which often communications teams do when they think, they're getting on our patch, how about you bring them in, wrap your arms around them again with the technology. What is this platform going to be doing? How are we going to make this platform work for us as the communicators? And then, the management and the treatment of data in a government context is much, much different to, the private sector. So again, you need to understand how do you use that data, which is then going to fuel, the digital marketing tactics that you may decide to use in order to build audience for the stories that you're trying to create. I think it is completely fascinating what's going on at the moment, and I think there's such a great opportunity that government will, in the not too distant future, really be able to have that great capability that they will be able to, in almost hopefully in real time, if we can get the approvals sorted out, be able to communicate, be able to explain to people, this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it. Now, they don't have to actually like it, because that's the way it works, that if that team wins and they win the election and they go into government, well, that's what they get to do. So, anyway, I do think we are at this massive change. And as you've just described, around data, around artificial intelligence, around behavioural insights, the impact of voice is going to be a massive change that government communication teams are going to have to get their heads around. But it's a huge change, for a lot of these traditional government departments, like as I mentioned, the anecdotes earlier around, putting together talking points, putting together FAQs, sending them up the line. And then, we're just a long way away in some parts of government from this agile, audience focused, digital first mindset that is absolutely required in this day and age, if in fact we are going to reap the benefit of that digital dividend as it relates to our business. But anyway, I will stop raving and ranting about this. But it's good. It's so exciting. I just think it's such an exciting time for us to really, those of us who work in this community of government communication, where I think there's going to be a big opportunity to come together and really start to get good at this, because I tell you, if we can get good at this, I think we can address some of the trust issues that are out there. And if we can do that, I think we can then, strengthen the communities, which I think is why we all come to work every day. So
I agree, but just reflecting on audience, David. I mean, I'm sure the listeners to this podcast, I mean, in a sense, we're preaching to the converted. I think because again, I think podcasting is a really, really interesting tool, and I'm really kind of surprised at the comeback it's made in the last 18 months. Of course, you were a pioneer with this podcast, but I'm hearing a lot more about particularly government communication functions. Getting in there and producing those niche podcasts that serve niche audiences, but nevertheless, those niche audiences are very engaged.
Absolutely.
But
that's again where we are now. This is what technology's done. It's the era of broadcast is finished. We are now absolutely in narrowcast, because people now can choose what it is that they want to listen to, and the narrower you can be, I think, the better.
Yeah, agreed.
And I think, and I think government, indeed, there is so much great information, and there are so many talented people and so many skillful, knowledgeable people inside government. I think we'd be mad not to try to unlock that vast reservoir of knowledge that will really enrich the understanding of different parts of what government does, which is really to touch every part of the community.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, again, for the listeners of this podcast, I think, I'm sure they're already sort of being bold and creative and innovative and brave in, talking to, their bosses at the departments, and encouraging them to think about investing time or resources in this new technology, because I tell you, those who are doing that are going to be the ones that are going to get ahead and be known and build the reputation for great communication, and there's lots of people out there that's doing some really great stuff in this space. And I think credit to you for this podcast, because you're helping kind of spread that message and get people kind of excited about it. So good on you. Yeah,
no problem at all. Love to do it. I think we're up to 200 and I think we're about 250 episodes now, because we originally called it In Transition. But then we moved it to GovComms, and I think actually maybe not 200. Maybe it's not that many. Maybe I think it's about maybe 200 and. I don't actually know. It's probably it is over 200 though. It is over 200. So but again, it's and I think you can sort of pick it up. It just absolutely jazzes me, this opportunity that we've got. And I think the more that we do talk about it, the more we experiment, the more we can profile people who are doing great work in this field. That the better off we're all going to be. So. Anyway, listen, I've taken up way too much of your time, and I think we've gone a bit over time. I know we've gone over time, but fascinating conversation, Andrew, and thank you very much for joining us on GovComms, and best of luck with your next endeavour, wherever that may be. But certainly I'm sure it'll be somewhere in the communication, government communication, public sector space.
Yeah, good on you, David. Thank you for the opportunity to chat. Thank you.
Okay, and to you, the audience, thank you for coming back once again. Went a little bit over time today, but, that's the way it happens sometimes. Great conversation, really. Just you can see some of the innovation there that Andrew's put in place. Clever thinking, simple thinking. That journal. Where's that story? That idea of, okay, we're going to go and do this story, but let's do something for the internal team. Let's get a few of them to go on the train. And I haven't seen that video, but I could just see the smiling faces of these people who've done all this hard work. Wouldn't have taken much to chop it together And it would have spread like wildfire, I'm sure, inside the planning department there, where they could see, hey, look at that. And imagine, people see that value, they work a bit harder, and they can see that return for them. So that was a great insight there. And I think we should need to be so mindful of our internal communications and building strong teams and making sure that we are sending that message back into the organisation about the great work that they are doing and really profiling that as well. And we'll do more about internal communications into the future as well, because it's something that I'm really getting interested in at the moment. But for the moment, thanks for coming back again this week. I'll be back at the same time in a couple of weeks' time with another fantastic guest here on GovComms. But for the moment, it's bye for now.
You've been listening to the GovComms podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate and subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes.